I'm really thrilled to have Lord Robertson of Port Ellen here this evening to deliver this evening's lecture. I mean, he's had a fantastic career in public service, not least for kicking me out of office in 1997. But during his time, he was best known as the Defence Secretary in Tony Blair's first cabinet, when he conducted the Strategic Defence Review, which led to the creation of the Joint Rapid Reaction Force and the commissioning of 2 new aircraft carriers. But it's his I've no doubt you'll find a way of asking a question at the end that involves ships. But it's his characteristically sharp, witty exchanges across the dispatch box during his time as Shadow Secretary of Scotland, which left an indelible mark on me and which I remember with real affection. And we've become very good friends. I don't need to tell you about his career. I mean, he's been the 10th Secretary General of NATO, the third British citizen to serve in that role. And it covered probably, well, we used to say the most turbulent. It's pretty turbulent at the moment, but in the transatlantic alliance's history with the 9/11 terrorist attacks to the first and so far only invocation of NATO's Article 5. And George's firm hand was on the tiller, and he stayed the course during that turmoil. So as author of the Government's Strategic Defence Review and chair of our International Relations and Defence Committee, he's been driving the debate, helping to bring defence and security to where it should be, to the forefront of our national conversation, more so than it has been for many years. So it is in this context that I asked George to deliver this evening's lecture entitled, "A Gathering Storm, Is Britain Really Safe?" In the light of this, the inimitable words of Henry V, Act 3, Part 1, I think it is, come to mind. "In peace there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger." Please welcome George Robertson to deliver this lecture.
Thank you, Lord Speaker, for the great pleasure and burden of doing this lecture tonight. And as you say, we have a bit of a history behind us as well. I remember removing you as the Member of Parliament for Stirling in days gone by, but we've become very good friends since these days. So I want to do one thing quite unusual for a politician at the beginning, and that is to answer the question. The question I posed in my title, is Britain really safe? And unambiguously, my answer is no, it is not. And then the following question, however, should always be, and therefore, what do we do about it? And to that I say, read the Strategic Defence Review 2025, because the current situation is there candidly and reasonably laid out, and so too is the way in which our country can build war readiness and hence deterrence in order to make us safe in the future. The wholesale transformation about how we do defence is there, and it is all ready to go. But let me start off with 2 quotes. The first one is from that legendary investor, Warren Buffett, who failed to spot the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and he invented the Noah rule. The Noah rule is predicting rain doesn't count, building arks does. And my second quote is from Sir Winston Churchill, who in his account of the Second World War, and if you remember, he said, history will judge me well because I intend to write it. His first volume was actually called The Gathering Storm. And this is what he said in July 1936. He said, "The months slip by rapidly. If we delay too long in repairing our defences, we may be forbidden by superior power to complete the process." So the message from both of these is quite clear. If the country is going to be safe again, we have to ask robustly and early and firmly. If deterrence fails, then standing as we would be in the rubble and destruction of our homes, our hospitals and our schools, it will be no good to cry out, well, we protected the fiscal rules. And I would like, therefore, in this platform tonight to offer some limited advice to the new Prime Minister who in a few days' time will personally carry the heavy burdens of protecting the nation. And my message is this. According to both NATO and to Keir Starmer, Russia, the immediate threat, may well have reconstituted and rebuilt its depleted forces by the year 2020. And that is just over 3 years' time. And it will be then ready to attack the alliance. I don't believe that you can legitimately acknowledge that and then not vote the money to ensure that we are ready and prepared. So let me be blunt. We are running out of years and we're running out of time. The action plan that is laid out in the Strategic Defence Review has got to be addressed. There is no greater priority. And how it is to be financed will be among the trickier dilemmas that the new Prime Minister next week is going to have to face. Andy Burnham, in his article in the Times last week, said the right things. He said, it is right that we rebuild our hard power for a new era that is very different to the one which military equipment was first designed. Now, a few weeks ago, I hit the headlines by attacking a corrosive complacency in this country. And although it was seen as an attack on Keir Starmer, I actually directed it much more widely, and I do so again. There is a conspiracy of wishful thinking in Britain, which will only be punctured by the organised national conversation on defence and security, which was promised in the Strategic Defence Review and in the National Security Strategy. Our people need to know the dangers and the threats and the way in which our adversaries are planning and preparing. They need to know and need to be reminded about how vulnerable we are to attack both now and in the future. And only then will they countenance the uncomfortable trade-offs that are going to be required in order to make us safe. Andy Burnham seemed to acknowledge this necessity in that same Times article. I want to be more open, he said, about how and where defence spending is spent. Our increased investment must be combined with an increase in scrutiny. Well, actually, he'll find the answer to that desire in the Strategic Defence Review, where we specifically address the whole question about the speed and effectiveness of defence procurement and recommended ways in which that scrutiny could be established. The government, any government, our government, has to point out to the British precisely what the stakes actually are. If you remember, the ordinary citizens, the European citizens of Bakhmut and Mariupol in eastern Ukraine, just over 4 years ago, innocently they were preoccupied, just as we are today, with schools and housing and the cost of living. And then they weren't. Suddenly, the land was invaded by Putin's Russia, and they now live under Russian occupation with its wanton violence, child abductions, and the physical and human destruction. So the threat is no longer theoretical, it's horribly real, and it is remarkably close to all of us. A colleague in this House recently tasked me with this question. He said, Russia, a nuclear power with a vast army, has failed to subjugate Ukraine. and whilst losing thousands of soldiers every week, is actually making little or no progress. How could they possibly take on NATO? Well, it was a fair question to ask, and he's not alone in asking it, and one which needs answers. So I directed them to the Strategic Defence Review, which is still a statement now of British government policy. And I quote, it says, "The UK and its allies are once again threatened by other states with advanced military forces. The UK is already under daily attack with aggressive acts from espionage to cyber attack and information manipulation, causing harm to society and to the economy." That's the reality, and that is the government position. So in the sub-threshold area, the grey zone, Russia's already waging war on us. And we are, in the UK, we are the main targets. According to Dr. Jade McGlynn of King's College, who's an expert on Russian public opinion, Britain is cast by the Kremlin as a historical civilizational opponent. We're seen by the Russian elite, especially as a particularly influential adversary. And this shapes the propaganda and the wider foreign policy of the Russian government. We're particularly vulnerable as an island nation. It was once our protection, but when 99% of all the data we use comes in undersea cables, and 77% of our essential gas supplies come in one pipeline, you get the message of how little the seas and oceans actually protect us. And our critical national infrastructure, telecommunications, water, electricity, are all on a knife edge. And in that grey zone, the Kremlin knows exactly what to do. The poisoning of Litvinenko, the attacks in Salisbury show the long reach of the FSB and the SVR. And they know how to penetrate our democratic societies. Sabotage operations now across Europe are now contracted out to organised criminals. And disinformation campaigns have been the subject of regular reports from Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee. And actually looking through the eyes of the Kremlin's malign strategists, it all makes perfect sense. Undermining the West's values of free speech, free press, and free elections is, in the short term, easier than taking on the military might of NATO. When Presidents Xi, Putin, and Kim Jong-un stood beside each other in Tiananmen Square earlier this year, they weren't actually tourists, nor were they simple spectators. They were united in one thing, shattering the appeal of the West, intent on undermining and ultimately replacing the reach of the EU and NATO and the United States as well. The lessons we learned in the Cold War were that values are simply platitudes unless they're protected by firmness and purpose. Deterrence may not actually be enough. The fighting ability to take back every inch will also be very necessary. That's why our defence budget has to be seen not just as an engine for growth, as it is, not just as a way of equalising north and south, as it is, but fundamentally the nation's insurance policy. And the holder of that policy is NATO, the most successful alliance of like-thinking nations that the world has ever seen. And that's precisely why the Strategic Defence Review concluded that our national defence is collective defence, with NATO first. Our role in NATO can't be underestimated, and our leadership has, up to now, been unquestioned. But it has to be earned at a time of unique turbulence in the world. We can't be expected to continue to hold the position of the deputy to the Supreme Allied Commander, for example, without playing a significant part in SACEUR's war plans, particularly when other European nations are stepping up to the plate. That position of Deputy Supreme Allied Commander is hugely important, gives us enormous clout, and was, of course, first held by General Bernard Montgomery. It's a brutal fact that we are now slipping down the league table in NATO. Spending as a proportion of GDP and in terms of our contribution to SACEUR's force goals, we're proving to be lamentable. We've not yet published our pathway to the agreed 3.5% of GDP. And in fact, the Defence Investment Plan only projects 2.7% by 2030, the year the present Prime Minister says that we might expect an attack. That's only 0.02% more than the figure which led to the resignation of John Healey, one of our best defence secretaries. And it's not nearly good enough in NATO leadership terms. But actually, talking in percentages doesn't give the full flavour of the challenge that is posed by 3.5%. What it means is adding £40 billion a year to the existing defence budget of £62 billion. £40 billion extra on top of the £62 billion that we spend. That's a lot of money, especially when there's not a lot of it to spare. So last week's NATO summit in Ankara was indeed a moment of truth for the whole alliance. With European and Canadian defence spending and spending on the right capabilities is now rising substantially, so the burden shifting that has been promised for years is now starting to take effect. A combination of President Putin and President Trump has forced the non-US members of NATO to recognize that the protection of their own people should be our own responsibility and not contracted out to the taxpayers of the United States of America. And yet, the disproportionate role of the United States inside NATO, and it's constantly talked about, that disproportionate role has been enormously to the advantage of the United States, even if they rarely acknowledge that fact. It gives the US the leadership of an alliance of 31 other countries who have always come to the assistance of the American interest. It amplifies global United States influence. Not only that, the $500 million that the non-US allies spend magnifies the total amount spent on defence in the whole of the Euro-Atlantic area. And a lot of that is spent on American hardware. Even President Trump, the author of the famous book, knows that that is a bargain worth having as well. So that rebalancing last week inside the alliance was recognized by that president and the commitment to Article 5, the attack on one being an attack on all. And that was described in the Ankara Declaration as being an ironclad commitment, and that is a big step forward. That provision in the North Atlantic Treaty is the bedrock of the NATO commitment. I'm the only person, as Michael has said, the only person to invoke Article 5, and that was in defense of the United States of America 25 years ago. And I hope sincerely to be the only person ever to invoke it. But that situation depends crucially on the conventional strength and modernization of NATO forces and the deterrent effect that it has on any adversary or potential adversary. Nearly 1 billion people sleep safely in their beds every night thanks to Article 5. And we need to keep it real and we need to keep it meaningful. The nuclear umbrella over Europe has traditionally rested on the United States, but both Britain and France are also nuclear powers as well. And only Britain, of the two European powers, allocates our deterrent to NATO, and that adds to the umbrella's strength. That is, frankly, a truly awesome responsibility, and we pay substantially for it. The Defence Investment Plan that was published a couple of weeks ago makes it clear that our nuclear deterrent in total takes up 20 to 25% of our defence budget. It's a lot of money, a big proportion. It's a significant proportion, and it inevitably squeezes the conventional role that we play in NATO and in the wider world. And yet in the Kremlin, the kind of damage which our Trident missiles would make in extremis to Russian cities makes the Russian military strategists pause and worry. So since the investment that we make in our independent nuclear deterrent, and it is huge, it's surprising that we make so little of it. We should be loud and proud that our investment in the submarine service of 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, sufficiently concerns those who might be tempted to launch a nuclear attack on our country. The fact that NATO does not account for our deterrent in its force goals is a matter of some regret, but the British public, I believe, should be immensely proud of the submariners who work long and hard under the seas and oceans to keep us and other NATO countries safe. The length of tours, and these are very long tours by our submariners, is just one sign of the hollowing out of our forces generally. At the end of the Cold War, we took a handsome peace dividend. We relaxed, and we genuinely thought that global conflict against us had actually been seen off. We were wrong. We were wrong. And as Secretary of State for Defence in 1997, I must share the blame for that misplaced optimism of the time. And so now we have to run in order to stand still. And recreating war readiness and hence deterrence will require more than ever, hence that 3.5%. Sir Bernard Grey, the former head of MOD procurement, and once upon a time my special advisor, wrote in the Observer a couple of Sundays ago, where he said this: "It's the same in many areas of UK defence. Of the 5 nuclear attack submarines that the UK has had in service, none is at sea. They're all in port being repaired for a variety of reasons, and 2 have been tied up for 3 years or more." Now, Treasury ministers have long harboured the belief, based on a few procurement scandals and the general stewardship of defence funds over the years, that giving money to the Ministry of Defence is like pouring good money after bad. But the Strategic Defence Review actually answers that, addresses that, and produces a remedy which should be read, especially in the Treasury, understood and now implemented as well. I truly believe that our country is not safe. I repeat what I've said before. We are underprepared, we're underinsured, we're under attack. Now, we all know that that is more than likely a fact, that it's been acknowledged, but the Strategic Defence Review actually tells us what we need to do to fix it. We worked on this historic and massively consulted and expertly advised review on the basis of a 10-year window, and spending of 2.5% of GNP. That was the limitation on the team who did this review. But the world since then has become more complex and turbulent since we finished a year ago, and we always said that it could be accelerated and implemented much sooner than that. And it certainly can be, and the dangers have increased and they have intensified substantially. And that's why NATO heads of government have agreed that 5%, 3.5 plus 1.5%, is the right figure to guarantee safety, and it has to be delivered. Finally, can I say, I should end with whatever optimism I can summon this evening. Ukraine is fighting back. Its long-range drones are inflicting real pain on Putin's Russian heartland. His population, in spite of the high pain threshold of the Russian people, are restive, and even dictators can sense the ground that is moving. I remember the quote from Robert Louis Stevenson, who once said, "Sooner or later, we all sit down to a banquet of consequences." And I think he should bear that in mind as well. At the first meeting that we had of the newly created NATO-Russia Council, which I chaired in May 2002, President Vladimir Putin said the following: "We should all remember that more than half a century ago, humanity paid with tens of millions of lives for the criminal short-sightedness and hesitation of politicians in joining forces against the common enemy. We are now facing a task which is comparable in scale by historical standards. Yes, the current threat is in a new guise and has a different ethos, but is no less dangerous for the fate of humanity." What he said was wise then, and it's a warning today. I normally start my presentations to audiences with the warning, "I am not going to cheer you up." But just let us be reminded. The future is what we make of it. It's not written down. It's not preordained. It's not a plan there for us. All of us have the capacity, the intelligence, and the resources in this world to make things better, much better than they look today. Consequently, let me end with the words of that famous philosopher, Charlie Chaplin, who said this: "I have a great interest in the future because that's what I intend to spend the rest of my life." Thank you very much.
My lords, ladies and gentlemen, I may have a French name, but I'm an Englishman, and unlike the Lord Speaker and Lord Robertson, I am an Englishman, and therefore I'll be quick. I'm very flattered to have been asked by the Lord Speaker to give the vote of thanks to Lord Robertson for his lecture today, and I do so wholeheartedly. I'm a supporter of the Strategic Defence Review, his Strategic Defence Review, no ifs, no buts. To his quotes from Warren Buffett and Sir Winston Churchill early in his speech, may I humbly offer another, making the very same point. It is from Vegetius, a Roman senator who in the 4th century AD said, "Si vis pacem, para bellum." If you want peace, prepare for war. Lord Robertson spoke of the need for an organised national conversation on defence and security as promised in the SDR and the National Security Strategy. Clausewitz made the same point in his remarkable Trinity, which argued, amongst other things, that if the people, the civilian population, do not have the ultimate will to win, a country will not win a drawn-out war. The present time has a strong feeling of 1938 about it, except that even if the politicians and the armed forces weren't ready then, as indeed, as Lord Robertson says, they aren't now, the people then had a remarkable resilience, and so were able to take, for example, the blitzes on our big cities on the chin. Would they today? That must be a serious concern. Article 3 of the Washington Treaty declares that all NATO member states must be able to defend themselves, as well as to contribute to the collective defence of the alliance. This includes the capacity both to resist an armed attack and to build a resilient society. As George said, the defence of our homeland is of great concern. We gave up resourcing it after the Berlin Wall came down and must now rebuild it from scratch, something else Lord Robertson covered in the SDR. As he said, the next Prime Minister has pledged to rebuild the country's hard power. Let us hope he does. But in emphasising that the public need to take their share of responsibility for protecting our country, let me give the last word to Milton Friedman, who said something like, if you put the government in sole charge of the Sahara Desert, in 5 years, there'd be a shortage of sand. George, thank you very much.